Hey, Tiffany, welcome to the Soul Aligned Self Care Podcast. I'm very excited to talk with you today and get to know you.
Thanks, Tina. I'm excited to be here.
Where are you in the world, by the way?
I am just south of Knoxville, Tennessee, but originally from Canada.
Okay. All right. Cool. So it's hot there too, I'm betting, right?
It's crazy hot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, to get started, if you could just tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you started to do what you do for in your business.
Absolutely. So I am a trauma hypnotist and high performance mindset coach. And I never really planned on moving into this space. In fact, I had tried life coaching one time before I really moved into it and decided that it just wasn't for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was really my own journey of healing trauma. So, long story short, I was abused by my stepmom growing up between the ages of 3 and 7. She would lock me in closets, burn me with curling irons, tell me that strangers hated blonde haired, blue eyed girls. And so every time I acted up or was, being too loud or whatever, she would drive me to the outskirts of the city I was from for a stranger to come and get and kill. And she would threaten to kidnap me multiple times so that I'd never see my mom, my stepdad, my brothers again. And so all of that I didn't realize had until my late 20s. I didn't realize that was abuse. There was always a justification like, well, somebody else has it worse, or it was only until I was 7. It was only every other weekend. So I had all these ways of justifying it in my mind. And then I realized that it had led to me creating all sorts of unhealthy beliefs that were keeping me stuck and really stopping me from living up to my potential. So, beliefs around my worthiness and my lovability and what I tolerated in the world. It led to me becoming an overachieving, people-pleasing perfectionist who, was just chronically burnt out because nothing I did was ever enough in my own mind. And so that all kind of came to a head. I lived in Australia for 8 years. And when I was there, I had been dating somebody for 3 years. The day I found out I was pregnant, I found out that he had a girlfriend in another state, and my entire life collapsed.
Wow.
That led to, I ended up finding out that he was actually a compulsive liar. So most of what I thought was true over 3 years was not. Then I ended up miscarrying the baby, and that brought me to a darkness that I never knew was possible. And I had suicidal ideation at that point. And I realized one day I was standing on the corner in downtown Melbourne and I seen this taxi coming and I thought, one well-timed step and all my pain goes away, but nobody else thinks that I'm like selfish for ending it. And so mentally I committed to taking this step, but when I went to take the step, physically my feet were rooted to the ground. I could not move. And yeah, so it was
That's
that
very intense.
it was very intense. And I realized in that moment, if I didn't start healing, then I wasn't going to survive much
Hmm.
longer. And so I started with all of the things that didn't really work. I mean, I did talk therapy. That really helped me understand that I had been abused, but it didn't go any deeper than that. I did the rah-rah events, where you hug people and loud music and all of that. And then I would leave feeling great and I'd get back into my life and I'd be like, I have no tools to still navigate the world. And so ultimately that led me to hypnosis and to NLP and then to somatic practices, which completely transformed my life. I realized that I had a gift for it as well. And so I started sharing that with the world.
I What a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that with me. That's pretty intense, and I'm sorry that you had to go through that, but I'm glad that you turned it into something positive for yourself. So that's really cool. And so you
Yeah.
talked about hypnotherapy. Most people know what that is, and then NLP,
Mhm.
and then somatic practices. So if you could tell us what is NLP, and maybe also talk a little bit about the somatic practices.
Absolutely. So NLP is neuro-linguistic programming. So the neuro is really understanding how our brain wires itself. and how it's rewiring itself every day, right? Like the brain that people had at the beginning of this episode will be completely different to the brain they had at the end. So how do we use that intentionally to change what we believe, to change what we think, right? A lot of people in the self-help world talk about like change your thoughts, change your life, which is true, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not as simple as, oh, I just had a bad thought, I need to replace it, right? That just creates like shame and
Mm-hmm.
more of a spiral. So we look at actual tools to help us reprogram based on how the brain already works. The linguistics looks at the words that we use both in our head and when we're communicating, because it's called spelling for a reason. When
Mm-hmm.
we communicate, we create a spell. So how can we again use that to our advantage? And then the programming is the outcome. So the habits, the routines, the behaviors that we regularly engage in. When we change how the brain is wired and we change the words we use, the end outcome is that we get different programming. We show up in the world in a different way. And then the somatic practices is incorporating the nervous system. So, a lot of, like in the medical world, for example, when I was a teenager, I was a runner and I
Mm-hmm.
had really bad knee pain, and they only ever honed in on my knee. They didn't look at like, what was my hip doing? Turned out I had weak glutes, but I didn't figure that out until I went to university and
Mm-hmm.
studied medicine, right? They didn't look at my foot. They just looked at what's wrong with the knee. And this happens in self-help as well. It's like, well, what's wrong with my brain? But it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't realize that the brain is part of a system that is connected to our body. So the process that I've created to help people, we call Rise.
Mm-hmm.
So we start with the somatic practices, firstly regulating and healing the nervous system. Most people live their life in survival mode, which
Mm-hmm.
means you can only go so far, right? And I didn't have this in my practice when I first started, and people would get these massive transformations and there would be like a little bit of a slide back, not all the way back to where they
Yeah.
started, but a little bit of regression
Same.
until we started incorporating the nervous system piece. And it was like, oh, this is allowing people to feel safe enough to make that change, right? And so we always start
Yes.
with those somatic practices. The R is also reprogramming limiting beliefs. And then we do the inner child healing for the I with the hypnosis.
Mm-hmm.
With hypnosis, we also do the S, which is shift your identity. And then the E is about expanding your limitations. So now that we know how the brain works, how can we constantly create expansion in our life and, stepping outside of our comfort zone, pushing the boundaries of our potential by just simple lifestyle changes?
I love that. Now, I experienced the same thing with the somatic practices, and it's a necessary part. And I think that's why talk therapy only goes so far with people, is because they're not integrating those somatic practices. So, if you could tell the audience some somatic practices that you use, so they know what that is, because a lot of people don't know what that is.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a range of, you can have
Well,
like yoga practices, breathing
mhm,
techniques. I typically start people with breathing techniques because it's the easiest, the fastest, like the lowest barrier to entry.
mhm,
So, one that I typically start people with is box breathing. This is a very powerful.
yes.
Navy SEALs use it. So, if they can use it to regulate their anxiety and whatnot going into like major missions, then us everyday people can use it as well. But basically, what you do is you breathe in for 4 counts, you hold for 4 counts, you breathe out for 4 counts, you hold for 4 counts. And you're going to do that a minimum of 4 times up to a couple minutes.
Yeah, box breathing is one of my favorite methods, and it helps me lower my blood pressure. Like it's helped me. Breath work has helped me so much that I was able to go off my blood pressure medicine,
That's
which I
amazing.
wasn't. I was only on for a few months, and once I realized that there was nothing wrong with me, it was just me having to control my stress and my anxiety levels. I tried everything, and that's when I went into using somatic therapy in my practice also. And I love how, like, exactly what you said at the beginning was like, until I started implementing that, people would have that slide back, and you're like, what's going on, right? And then when you start integrating those somatic practices, it makes such a big difference. But it's never like a one size fits all kind of thing. I found using different somatic practices, but I did a little research before I talked to you today, and I was on your website, and I find your history like very interesting because you went to school for kinesiology, right?
Yeah.
And you
In the
do,
sports medicine sense,
yeah,
not the energy work sense. Yeah.
yeah. And then you work with fitness and nutrition and yoga, and then it said acro yoga and mindfulness. And another thing that was mentioned was art. I'm not sure how to say this, archetypical coaching or archetypal coaching. Can you say that? How do you say that?
Archetypal coaching. So,
Thank you.
yeah, one of my early mentors created a set of 8 archetypes to just help understand like how we show up in the world. And we have like 4 main archetypes, for example, and then
Hmm.
we have 4 challenge archetypes. So, we have an order that we use our main archetypes in to have the most success and to get into flow. And then we have our 4 challenge archetypes where we have to learn those lessons to overcome self-sabotage patterns.
Well, that's very interesting. That could be probably a whole podcast episode.
That could be, yes.
So when it comes to NLP, you talked about how it's not as simple as just rewriting the thought or rewriting the programming. How do how could you like explain to the audience how it works like on a deeper level to change those thought processes in your head?
Yeah, so we have 2 major parts of our mind. The first is the conscious mind, which is only 4% of the mind's capacity. And then we have the unconscious mind, which is 96% of the mind's capacity. So logic, reason, willpower, that all sits with the conscious mind, right? Our goals and dreams, that's the conscious mind. The
Hmm.
unconscious mind, its primary goal is to keep us safe. And it's actually wired to resist change. And this is
Hmm.
why most people don't make change until the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of change, is because we're not actually wired for it.
Hmm.
And so the unconscious mind is our belief systems, our experiences, our memories, the stories that we've told ourselves repeatedly. So if let's say we kind of take mainstream self-help advice that says like change your thoughts, right? So you have a negative thought, replace it with a positive. And that's a great place to start. It's just not the whole work, right? A
Hmm.
lot of people take step 1 and then they're like, well, nothing is changing. It's like because you haven't done B, C, and D, right? You haven't done
Hmm.
steps 2, 3, 4. So if if we're changing our thoughts, that's our conscious mind. So it requires some willpower to do that. If we're not getting enough sleep, if we've made a lot of decisions in a day, if we haven't gotten enough to eat or to drink, our ability to tap into that willpower significantly decreases, right? And
Hmm.
so that's not a winning strategy. Like I say to people, relying just on willpower to change your thoughts is like going to Vegas and saying that you believe the 4% can overpower the 96% the majority of the time. And that's just
Hmm.
not the case, right? If you're not going to bet your life savings on that, why bet your life on that? Why bet your future
Hmm.
on that? And so the other piece of it is that our unconscious mind is playing things in the background on like almost an audio track that we may not consciously be aware of. And so when that's happening, um, we are we're not able to change those, right? Because it's like playing in the background and it's not something that's in our conscious awareness. So then we don't have the ability to change that. And this is why, again, affirmations are a great place to start, but they're not the only piece to making change. Because if between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, we have this gatekeeper. What you need to know about the unconscious mind is that it is very suggestible. There is no logic and reason. There's no like autocorrect, right?
Hmm.
Whatever gets into the unconscious mind is taken to be true. And then the unconscious mind seeks to create more evidence for it. And it will delete information from our environment. It'll distort information from our environment to match what has come into the unconscious mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if we are in the background thinking that it's not safe to make more money, but then we're standing here saying these affirmations of I am wealthy and I'm abundant and money flows to me. And those are all great affirmations. But if at the unconscious level, they don't align with your belief systems, they won't even make it past the gatekeeper. They'll just bounce off and they won't get in.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing that we can do is to actually reframe it by asking a question instead of making a statement, right? A statement can be rejected, but what a question does is it opens a loop to the unconscious mind. And the
Mm-hmm.
unconscious mind wants to solve problems and it hates open loops because open loops mean we're sending energy to try and figure that out. So it will try to close that loop as quickly as possible. So if I asked a question, how can I attract abundance to me daily? How
Mm-hmm.
can I, feel safe with money? My unconscious mind will start finding the answers for us, and that'll start coming up. So if we're just, focused on, and then the last part is if we're just focused on changing our thoughts, when we become aware of how many negative thoughts we have, and on an average day, we have about 60,000 thoughts, and 80% of those are negative, then
Mm-hmm.
for 80% of your day, you're reframing your thoughts, which means you're not going to get a whole lot else done. And that's going to bring up feelings of like inadequacy and shame and doubt. Can I even do this? Or even overwhelm, like, oh my gosh, I have so many negative thoughts because most people don't pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that kind of sets you up for failure if if your only strategy for change is, well, every time I have a negative, I need to replace it with positive. Again, it's a great starting spot, but there's other pieces that will really accelerate that journey.
Yeah, I could see you explained that very well. So I really appreciate that because people hear about NLP all the time. And, we'll be talking about it on a podcast. And in the background, I could just visualize people being like, what the heck is NLP and how does it work? Or what are somatic practices? What the heck is that? So thank you
And,
for explaining all those things.
and I'll just say, like, if you Google NLP, or, you've heard of NLP before, it's common referred, like linked to manipulation, right?
Yes, yes,
And so then a
definitely.
lot of people I've had people come to my programs and they're like, at the end of the weekend, they're like, I didn't know this was an NLP course at the beginning. And I'm glad I didn't, because if I knew upfront that I was learning NLP, I wouldn't have joined because
Hmm.
I had such a negative belief about it. And what people don't realize is in society, manipulation has a negative connotation, but the word manipulate just means to mold.
Hmm.
Right. So we don't look at an artist who's manipulating clay and say, oh, that person is a terrible person.
Hmm.
Don't realize is that we manipulate ourselves. We hypnotize ourselves on a daily basis with our belief systems. And
Hmm.
most of these belief systems, 95%, in fact, of the belief systems that we have as adults were planted in the mind between the ages of 0 and 7. And then we have sought out at an unconscious level, we've sought out evidence that that was correct.
Hmm.
So if you created a belief, I created a belief when I was young that it wasn't safe to have money. How was that belief created? We would spend a lot of time with family friends or with members of our extended family, aunts, uncles, etc. And as soon as those people started making more money, and I'm not even sure what that number was, because I didn't understand it at that time, but as soon as they started making more money, my parents would stop talking to them and would start talking crap about them behind their back, and I would overhear it. So it didn't even happen to me,
Hmm.
but I created this belief that if you made too much money, you would be abandoned and you would be judged, right? And people would talk crap about you. And so for a long time, I held myself under this financial ceiling so that that wouldn't happen, right? I
Hmm.
had to live
Yeah,
paycheck to paycheck in order to be accepted by my family. Was my
yeah,
belief system, but that didn't serve me, right? But I constantly looked for evidence that that was the case. Every time I made more money, my parents would not talk to me for a while, right? Now, was it a case of they weren't calling me because they were mad that I made more money, or was it that I unconsciously expected them to stop talking to me and so I wouldn't call them?
yeah.
Right. So our limiting beliefs become this self-fulfilling prophecy that we've manipulated ourselves or hypnotized ourselves to create. So all NLP is about is seeing that manipulation and hypnosis is part of a daily, it's part of our daily life. We're being hypnotized by the government, by the school system, by the medical system, by the media, by ourselves, by our friends and family, by what we see on social media. Like everything around you is a form of manipulation and hypnosis. Somebody wants you to see their point of view or understand them. They're trying to manipulate, mold your beliefs and opinions to match theirs, right? And so when we understand that, we can take our power back and we can have more discernment around what am I actually going to choose to
Mhm.
believe.
Yes, and that's when you empower yourself. That's when you can learn to start curating the experience that you want to have in your life because you do have control over these things. And I
Yeah.
love how you explained that. So, how can people connect with you and find you so that they could, learn more about these different practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look up Tiffany Toombs, you will find me on any social media platform.
Hmm.
I'm the least active on LinkedIn, but we're active everywhere. We also have a podcast called The Cycle Breaker Show, and you can connect with me on any of those places.
Great. We'll put those links in the show notes. I want to thank you again for coming on, and I want to thank you for sharing your story because I believe that when we share our stories, we just show people how much more connected we all are, and it helps people move forward. It helps people heal. So I want to really thank you for doing that. I really appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.